Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. The latest United States productivity statistics were alarming to say the least, but got little notice by the business media compared to the highly manipulated non-farm payrolls and unemployment statistics. I'm obviously dating myself by saying there was a time this measure was watched closely. Of course, that was also an era of investors and money managers versus traders and passive ETF funds. In this session, I want to talk labor productivity and its importance to the economy. There are currently more U.S. job openings than there are unemployed people. We have a major labor shortage in the United States and, frankly, in the developed economies. We don't need economic data, just look around us. The help wanted signs are everywhere. Hiring parties, sign-on bonuses. One billboard advertised $5,000 sign-ups as a bonus for corrections officers. But the problem is totally across the board. It's not in low-paying jobs or in certain sectors. It's on Wall Street and it's on Main Street. It's everywhere. But why? What is actually going on? It has a major consequence. I just read that BlackRock is bumping pay by 8%. The shortages are reported as caused by a number of factors: COVID, planet changes, or the elephant in the room, which is Fed policy. The Fed created 85% of all money in existence in the last 18 months. Think about that for a moment. Though this affects the economy in a number of ways, the most obvious of which are markups. But that has also created a labor shortage because of stimulus, which is definitely an important driving factor. I've heard people state that after making money trading Bitcoin, they simply don't feel like going to work at Starbucks in the morning the next day. That's a tangible example, but there are hundreds of others. How about the employees that have taken early retirement, such as police officers fearing the backlash of the Black Lives Matter movement? Those officers needed to be replaced, and hence the job openings with no one to fill. What about people not working to avoid the vax mandates? What we have is a complex set of trend events. The question is, what will the result of this be to Americans' labor force and its productivity in the long run? Here is the spoiler alert. Lower productivity means weaker profitability. The S&P operating margins are in a good place to begin. Operating margins are before tax and interest, both of themselves under serious pressure. We just passed a massive bill labeled the Inflation Reduction Act, which will mandate a 15% minimal corporate tax. CEOs are paid to increase profitability. A 15% bottom line hit, in many of the cases, will be passed on to the public. We have rising interest rates driven by an increasing Fed funds rates expected to reach 4% before topping out in 2023. Both these will impact corporate productivity. But it is worse because operating margins are all at all-time highs, with mounting pressures on wages, benefits, input costs, local taxes, utilities, and even insurance. These are pressures that must be overcome to reverse the current slide in productivity. How much harder and smarter can we work? Most workers today tell me they are stressed out. For 45 years, corporate America has been able to dictate to labor and unions because of downsizing, right-sizing, outsourcing, and offshoring. This is because of globalization and the cheap labor arbitrage of Asian and Chinese workforces. My colleague Charles Hugh Smith's research suggests that this contributed approximately $50 trillion being siphoned off from workers between 1975 and 2018. This additionally helped the statistical measure of U.S. productivity improvement during this era. We should expect going forward for corporate margins to normalize. Minimally, we should expect a 50 to 61.8% retracement. We actually think it'll be worse because the corporate 45 years of feasting on the fat hog is highly likely over. It will also be worse due to the extensive list of complex set of events we listed earlier. As such, we hope to explore these factors impacting operating margins and U.S. productivity by discussing the subjects outlined here. So how bad is the current decline in U.S. productivity? Why is it currently falling, and why are we paying workers more to produce less? Which, by the way, matches a U.S. economy consuming more than it produces. How long can both go on? Non-farm productivity declined at 4.6% annualized rate in the second quarter, marking the second consecutive decline. The trend in productivity growth has worsened compared to prior to the pandemic, and the surge in unit labor costs makes the Fed's challenge of getting inflation back down to its 2% target all the more challenging. Frankly, I don't recall seeing productivity charts going negative before. The second quarter's contraction comes on the heels of the sharpest decline in 74 years, which was negative 7.4% in Q1. Smoothing through the seesaw ride of quarterly productivity growth, the past year suggests that it has worsened compared to before the COVID-19 pandemic. Productivity growth was down at an annual rate of negative 0.4% over the past 4 quarters compared to the pre-pandemic average increase of 1.3%. Weak productivity growth makes the Fed's inflation challenge even harder. If workers are more productive, companies can afford to pay them more without pressuring profit or fueling a wage price spiral. This isn't what we're seeing today. Unit labor costs, that is, the productivity adjusted cost of labor, rose at a 10.8% annual pace in Q2. This marks the second consecutive quarter of double-digit gains and suggests businesses continued to pay workers more to produce less. Output is still normalizing from pandemic-driven demand, but with labor being the biggest expense of many businesses, if labor costs continue to soar amid falling productivity, business will be forced to shed labor to protect the bottom line. Businesses will be forced to increasingly seek investment in labor-saving technology to boost productivity. We're already witnessing this in AI robotics, which no doubt are only at the early stage of deployment. Today's tight labor market has forced employers to step up compensation and has pushed real labor costs for employers well above levels consistent with the Fed's 2% inflation rate. Of course, unit labor cost growth is exaggerated over the second quarter and even first, but it is still way too strong even when smoothing over a year or two. The Fed simply can't get to 2% inflation with this sort of productivity and wage growth. Labor costs tend to be a stickier contributor to inflation. Thus, the Q2 productivity data position forces the Fed to continue on its tightening path until it sees wage growth subside and inflation moving meaningfully lower. The reasons labor productivity has collapsed range far and wide, but they all come back to a few critical elements: overregulation, overtaxation, monetary expansion, credit market manipulation, and a near total intervention of economic and business life by a grossly out-of-control tax and spend regulatory state. Remember, production determines consumption. Production has collapsed. An extended period of economic decline will follow. Let's start to break down some of the major labor productivity issues to learn more, but first we should consider how much of the problem is actually global in scope. Global labor markets have been tight for a few years as unemployment rates have been steadily falling. The consensus is this is an aging population, lower birth rates, and relatively low levels of immigration. I say relatively only because we have seen mass refugee and asylum seekers in the EU. However, so far, they have not been major contributors to the labor force because of a lack of education, skills, or training, communications ability, or simply a desire for cultural adaptation. They have been a drain, therefore, on social services, which lowers overall productivity. Stagnant labor supply is also a long-term worry because a limited supply of workers could constrain the economy's growth potential in the long term. An undersized labor force means fewer workers to build cars or clean hotel rooms, limiting how much actual output the economy can produce. Departures from the labor force tend to be sticky, meaning that those who drop out for a considerable time can find it hard to return. In the U.S., wages and salaries for private sector workers rose 5.7% in the second quarter from a year earlier, the swiftest pace since records began in 2001, and wage growth accelerated again in July. This has been the swiftest pace since records began in 2001, and wage growth accelerated again in July, aggravating productivity. Demographics, as I said, are cited as a global problem, and this is true for the U.S. as well. The population of the U.S. changed between 2010 and 2020. America's population expanded by 22.5 million, but of this net increase, only 1.2 million were under the age of 55. The mass majority of 21.4 million were 55 or older. This is a little understood statistic. The consistent feedback I hear is that the work environment has become increasingly more difficult. I have seen note at places I've visited reading, and I quote, "We have to do more and more with less and less. Soon we'll be doing everything with nothing." End of quote. Work environments are seeing unscheduled multiple shifts being demanded because of worker shortages, resulting in a caustic culture and aggressive behavior amongst fellow workers. This is particularly noticeable in healthcare and airports where worker shortages are clearly evident. This leads to poor people interactions, starting from demanding and abusive and irate customers, to lack of training, staff turnover, to workload levels. All of this has made work itself more risky, frankly, and unpleasant. Another sign I've seen more than once is one that simply reads this: "They're not paying enough to put up with this." Training is another big problem for both the work environment and to fill the millions of open jobs available. 13 years ago, TV personality Mike Rowe began a campaign to bring awareness to the 2.3 million skilled jobs that were open across the country. And I quote him, "Today that number is approaching 11 million. Of note, most of those open jobs do not require a 4-year degree. They require training." End of quote. How can we be surprised by the nearly 11 million open jobs and labor shortages when there's a massive skills gap for years? And I quote him again, "It's a reflection of what we value. Unfortunately, many Americans don't value skilled labor," according to Rowe's vast first-hand experience. "If you're not grateful to the people who bring you affordable energy, plentiful food, smooth roads, heating, air conditioning, steel production, or indoor plumbing, you probably won't encourage your kids to explore careers in those fields. So why then would anybody be surprised when millions of people choose to accept money from the government instead of exploring ways to get training they need to fill any of these open positions?" Corporations are not investing in job trainings. Companies used to invest in training as apprenticeship programs. Let me tell you what it was like 50 years ago, just to give you a clear contrast. When I joined IBM with an undergraduate degree in engineering and postgraduate business, it was demanded that I spend 1 year in New York training before I'd be allowed to talk to a customer. I was 1 year as paid to go to their internal school. That doesn't happen today and hasn't happened in 30 years. Youth and parents are not investing in job training. Academic schooling, in the vast majority of instances, is not training. It is education, which only prepares you to be more readily trainable. As trained workers retire, insufficient trained backfills are being prepared. Again, knowledgeable people like Rowe are afraid, and as he says, things must go splat before the masses wake up. Rowe is not certain what splat will look like, but if he were to guess, he said, and I quote, "It will involve a serious spike in the cost of food, energy, and construction. A lot of packages are not going to be delivered on time." End of quote. There is little doubt COVID has made a serious problem much worse very quickly. Temporarily, it left us with enhanced unemployment benefits for too long, fear of COVID keeping people from going back to work, and lack of child care. On a permanent and structural basis, we lost 1.3 million because of caregiving and 2.6 million because of retirement. Then we had government public policy regulations concerning COVID mandates. These are being challenged in the courts, but has left many tens of millions out of work. Public service government workers, including first responders, military members, and air traffic controllers, to private employees such as pilots, corporate workers, that enforce the COVID-dictated mandates. Don't think for a moment these people have went back to their former employers. As someone recently said, "Over my dead body." There is a lot of productivity-killing anger, resentment, and frustration that was injected into the U.S. labor market because of the COVID mandates. In parallel, we are witnessing what is referred to as the Great Resignation. People are quitting in numbers we have not seen before. The reasons are varied according to surveys, from pent-up frustration and lack of job opportunities now allowing for resignations, to job burnout, to wanting more meaningful and contentment, to needing more freedom and autonomy. At the top of the list is better pay and benefits. This is the 50 trillion being squeezed from the workforce over the last 45 years we referenced earlier. The problem is receiving a living wage. 2 wage incomes are no longer sufficient. Extra part-time work is required, or simply accepting lower standards of living to survive. The tight job markets are now the catalyst for the major increases in wage and benefits, obviously. The shift from defined benefits to contributory benefits was a massive shift in America in the early part of the century, which was swallowed as part of the $50 trillion capital grab. The power is now back in the hands of workers. Decimated unions are now only beginning to flex their newfound and atrophied muscle. If all these issues associated with monetary, fiscal, and public policy issues weren't enough, we have an unprecedented shift in generational attitudes and priorities that don't necessarily bode well for labor productivity. We have a new social media and diversity-driven workforce that does not support the status quo. It is not a generation that often attends rallies, but rather is like molasses flowing into the machinery of capitalism and productivity. The latter will have to change to accommodate the former. The older generation failed to grasp this, but even Gen Xers, like Elon Musk, are somewhat cynical. I quote him, "Americans try to avoid going to work at all, as opposed to the Chinese workers who won't just be burning the midnight oil, but will be burning it at 3 a.m. The fact is that millions upon millions of Americans were happy to sit at home and do nothing for almost 2 years while collecting government payouts and living rent-free. Some have even tried to start an anti-work environment, demanding even more money and more respect for no-skill labor. The baby boomer generation, raised by what is termed the greatest generation, is inevitably fading away from its dominating influence over the last 60 years. The baby boomers have been steadily replaced in influencing culture and workforce norms by the Gen X and Gen Y. The Gen Xers born between 1965 and 1980 are now 42 to 57 in age, in total 65.2 million. The Gen Ys born between 1981 and 1996 are now 26 to 41 in age, in total 72.2 million. The attitudes of this 137.4 million working age workers now dominates the workforce. However, Gen Zs, that is Zoomers, born between 1997 and 2012 are now 10 to 25 in age and also total approximately 72 million. This group, still mostly students, are already having an impact on retail, fashion, music, and media industries, to name only a few. This group, added to Gen X and Gen Ys, are the new workforce. Gen X. Gen Xs are beginning to fill the leadership roles as baby boomers retire. Where boomers have experience, Gen Xs also have the qualifications. They are the first generation to use computers in their homes and schools. Brought up in an era of technology and social change, they're tech savvy and open to change. They thrive on diversity, challenge, responsibility, honesty, and having creative input. As an adaptable and fiercely independent generation, Gen Xs are more peer-oriented than previous generation, striving hard for a balanced work and family life. They are the first generation to use computers in their homes and schools, big spenders, and possess purchasing power when it comes to the higher-end purchases. More diverse than any previous generation as a result of immigration and a growing female workforce. Tech-savvy, having built the bridge from analog to digital, they developed some of the most influential websites which have revolutionized how the world operates and where we source information from, for example, YouTube, Amazon, Wikipedia, Google, etc. They're in the prime of their working lives and highly invested in their jobs. Millennials are the most educated generation in Western history. 34% of 25 to 29-year-old Americans held a bachelor's degree, master's degree, professional degrees, or doctoral degrees last year, a higher share than in any year in data going back to 1968. According to a senior fellow at Brookings, the share will probably increase as millennials, usually described as those born after 1980, mature. The millennial women are outperforming the millennial men in the classroom. Overall, millennial girls tend to outperform boys in elementary and secondary school, getting higher grades, pursuing tougher academic programs, and participating in advanced placement classes at higher rates. Additionally, 57% of today's undergraduates are women, and women now earning $170,000 more bachelor's degree each year than men. Mainstream media has drawn a picture of millennials as lazy, narcissistic, and entitled selfie lovers. What is well established, in fact, is that they are diverse, civic-oriented global citizens with strong, progressive, liberal-leaning views. Together, Gen X's and Ys reflect more diverse, being either minorities or having had single parents, computer communications-oriented, witnessed women emerging to 50+% of the labor force and who are career-oriented, more left-leaning, liberal, progressive, and collectivism-oriented views, more focused on work-personal balance, more highly educated but less trained, more indebted at the beginnings of their career, more status-conscious but less loyal to companies, who by themselves are less loyal, but they're more portable. The attitudes that impact labor and productivity include jobs are only an indicator of success to them, not the measure. Diversity, inclusion, and equality is their signature hallmark. Their labor must offer more than wages. They are intolerant of formality and restrictive rules. They have highly competitive and different moral code. Everything is fair in love and war. Though companies have changed, this change will accelerate. How productivity will be altered is still really to be determined. However, I think this article I read today reflects on that. The article is entitled, "Apple Employees Form Resistance Against Companies' Return to Office Plans." The labor's public petition statement in this conflict tells us a lot about the rapidly changing U.S. labor force's attitudes and expectations. Let me share some of their demands and expectations, and I quote them. "This uniform mandate from senior leadership does not consider the unique demands of each job, nor the diversity of individuals. Reasons that include disabilities, visible or not, family care, safety, health, and environmental concerns, financial considerations, to just being happier and more productive. The workers demand that Apple allows each of us to work directly with our immediate managers to figure out what kind of flexible work and arrangements are best for each of us and for Apple. The work arrangements should not require higher level approvals, complex procedures, or providing private information. The employees circulating the latest petition want Apple to encourage, not prohibit, flexible work, to build a more diverse and successful company where we can feel comfortable to think differently together." This all sounds very nice, but try and understand how management will now actually control the labor force towards being more productive. I understand that employees believe what they are saying, but my experience is that people must be managed. By that I mean consensus only goes so far before management must make hard decisions, which always alienate some. The more hard decisions being made, the more people who become alienated. In the economic world we now live in, management must make tough decisions continuously, simply to stay competitive and highly productive. I'll have more comments on this when we discuss the Zoom economy in a moment. Gen Zs are even more left-leaning and woke than the Gen Ys. They strongly support social movements such as Black Lives Matter, transgender rights, and feminism. Like it or not, the Ms and Zs will set policy, while Gen X will be the forgotten generation soon. The U.S. labor force is about to change in profound and unstoppable ways. The question is whether this will make us more productive. Maybe happier, but more productive? Yes, happy employers are productive employers, but maybe the question is more about what an employee is today. I wish I had time to discuss the emerging concept called quiet resignation, where employees establish their self-determined blend of work and personal balance and productivity. It seems there is a cancer growing in the American workforce. I encourage you to Google quiet resignation to learn more. Let's talk about what is referred to as a Zoom economy in the Gen Z Zoomer generation. JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon has been blasting working from home and Zoom as management by Hollywood Squares, as he calls it. He states in his experience that remote work creates a working environment that's less honest and more prone to procrastination. He states, "It doesn't work for people who want to hustle. It doesn't work for culture. It doesn't work for apprenticeship programs. It doesn't work for spontaneous stuff. It doesn't work for idea generation." JP Morgan is reportedly tracking ID card swipes in order to ensure compliance with the new policy and monitoring the time employees spend on Zoom and an email to better measure productivity. Dimon further argues in his battle against working from home that it damages the U.S. drive for diversity. Dimon called the office a rainbow room, and that workers who stayed home were denying themselves opportunity to meet other people. If you live in certain parts of the country and you go eat out there, it's all white, meaning remote workers may end up having a more uniform experience than if they travel into work. Let's try and draw some conclusions here. Because frankly, some of these comments that are sounding negative, I think are the way of the future. And management is going to have to adjust to them because they're correct. But the question is, will it make us more profitable and productive? The hard facts are that to achieve profitability and productivity, corporations must endorse and embrace these new attitudes. The 45 years of labor squeeze for profitability are over. New programs and restrictions will place pressures on margins. Productivity and profitability will be under significant pressure. AI robotics are a central solution to labor productivity going forward. This graphic shows the result of a recent survey by PwC Pulse. The first 3 reflect what employees are demanding. The remaining 6 are about primarily reducing employee headcount. We can expect automation through AI robotics to rapidly increase to achieve profitability and productivity requirements in an increasingly competitive world. As a reminder, capitalism is founded on the theory and basic understanding that savings being invested into productive assets makes the labor force more productive, which in turn increases their standard of living. We now have a society with shrinking savings being replaced by credit, being spent instead on consumption versus productive assets, which does not increase productivity. Therefore, in a society consuming more than it produces, we are on the inevitable road to a reduced standard of living, a road that will mirror a fall in asset values. As I always remind you in these videos, remember politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success obviously go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom actually been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2022 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I sincerely thank you for listening.